Okay, so this is my presentation on Italy, intercultural communication with Italy. Um, the first thing we'll be looking at is ethnocentrism, which is kind of an overall look at cultures. And this was defined by William Graham Sumners, and he defined this as the technical name for this view of things in which one's own group is the center of everything and all others are scaled and rated with reference to it. So, this kind of ethnocentric view might mean that you think your culture is the best or that your culture is the one that everyone else should be looking to. And because of that, we often have our own kind of stereotypes or views of other cultures based off of our own ethnocentric views. So, we're going to look at a few of these kind of stereotypes that Americans have of Italians. So, if we look at this slide, we can see there's spaghetti. A lot of people think Italians yell or speak with their hands, and there's also the show Jersey Shore, which was a show of Italians that was on TV. Many of these stereotypes can be true, however, some of them are based off of a view that other cultures are lesser or not as good. And so, if we look at the example of Jersey Shore, we see a quote from Joy Bear, and she says, "Jersey Shore does not represent my culture. These idiots come out and make Italians look bad." So, Jersey Shore is an example of how Americans view Italians in a way that is not necessarily correct or accurate to how they truly are. So, if we look at what cultures actually are made up of, there are a few different values, and we're going to look at two different values. The first one is high versus low uncertainty avoidance, and the second one is polychronic versus monochronic. So, the first one, high versus low certainty avoidance. High certainty cultures will avoid things they are unsure of and try to stick to norms, whereas low uncertainty cultures are more open to new experiences and new frameworks. So, if we look at this in a study by Geert Hofstede, he said that Italians are more of high uncertainty, meaning that they do avoid things they're unsure of and they try to stick to the norms. Then we look at polychronic versus monochronic. Polychronic cultures can multitask. They have a much more free view of time. They're not as bound to it. Whereas monochronic cultures prefer to do one thing at once. They get that done and they move on to the next thing. Italians, as a culture, are viewed as polychronic, which means that they're very comfortable with multitasking. They also have strong values of family relationships, so they don't really place a huge emphasis on being on time to events or meetings. So, this will tie into later, as we'll see. It's necessary to expect delays and late events when in Italy you can't really expect a strict timeline because of their polychronic nature. So, if we continue on and look at how ethnocentrism affects stereotyping, although some stereotypes can be true, sometimes we have to make sure that our own ethnocentric view of our culture isn't getting in the way. So, stereotypes are not always true, especially ones found in mainstream media such as Jersey Shore. It's important to get to know an individual before you judge and get to know them and their view of their culture. So now we're going to look at the influence of language on culture. Language is another way that we can understand where a culture is coming from, and language can be defined in one way as the way individuals identify themselves and others. So language is very tied into identity and culture. So if we look at the Italian language, we're going to look at three idioms or commonly used sayings that are used in Italian language. The first one is "don't break my chestnuts," which is said to someone annoying. The second one is "you wanted a bike, now you've got to ride it." And this is said to someone who has gotten themselves into a situation and needs to accept responsibility. And the last one is "without hair on his tongue," which is said to someone to tell them not to sugarcoat the truth. So the first and the last ones of these kind of emphasize the fact that Italians are very straightforward, they're very truthful. The middle one, on the other hand, more emphasizes the ethic of hard work and the desire that they have to take responsibility. So we're going to look at that a little more in the uniqueness of the Italian language. So if we look at the history of the Italian language, it's heavily influenced by Italian. Like Spanish and French, the language is one of the modern Romance languages. It's similar in sound. Their values are found in language and they're very straightforward. They value trust, respect, they value passion, and they also, as we saw before, value a strong work ethic. So because of this, their culture and their language has a very strong emphasis on being truthful and straightforward. Not only this, the strong sense of family and culture leads to a sense of responsibility. Their beliefs are mainly Roman Catholic, and then the environment, which I thought was interesting, Italy has very hilly terrain, and that's led to the creation of different independent states or regions, which in turn leads to a strong family alliance. So basically, because of this kind of separation between different states, the people are very loyal to their own regions versus their country. So that kind of just points again, like I said, to the strong family ties. But not only is language an aspect that people communicate within cultures, so is nonverbal communication. So we're going to look at a few different aspects of this. Nonverbal communication includes kinesics, proxemics, haptics, paralinguistics, chronemics, physical appearance, oculesics, and olfactics. So the first slide here, we're going to look at kinesics. Kinesics is basically the different hand motions and gestures that people use when speaking to each other. So Italians, as we saw before in the stereotypes, they're known for their hand gestures, and so many of their hand gestures have specific meanings. So it's almost like a form of sign language. And so here on the slide we see a hand gesture that means get lost. So unlike in the United States, they actually have specific phrases that go with their hand gestures. Now, if we look at proxemics, this is basically how close you stand to someone, the spatial understanding of a culture. So in Italy, extended physical contact is normal. People stand very close. In the United States, people tend to stand a few feet away from each other, if not more, whereas in Italy, they're very close. Contact is pretty normal, as we can see in haptics, which is the kind of the nonverbal communication aspect that includes how people communicate through touch. And in Italy, touch is very acceptable and common, and it's not usually a flirtatious behavior as it would be here. Like if someone touches your arm or touches your shoulder, that's really not a flirtatious thing there. It's just the way they communicate and connect with one another. Paralinguistics is the study of how a person speaks, basically like tone, pitch, volume. And Italians, as we again saw in stereotypes, are very known for being loud and passionate when they're speaking. Because of this, it doesn't necessarily signify that they're angry or that they're upset. It just means that they may be passionate about what they're talking about or they're trying to get their point across. So because of this, you definitely don't have to be a quiet or meek personality going to Italy. They will not get offended if you're loud or rambunctious. We look down at chronemics, which is how the study of how a culture relates to time. And we saw this before, that Italy is a polychronic culture, which means that you really do not have to stress about time. They don't stress about time. They value relationships more than the clock. And then finally, we'll look at physical appearance, which is something that is very important to Italians, and they value being put together, looking classy, and basically commanding respect by the way they dress. So here we see a picture of men in suits. So that is just an aspect of what Italy is known for, is really being a put together looking person. However, it's also important if you're traveling to a holy site or a church that you are more modest. Generally, they're pretty casual, even though they are classy. But when visiting a church, it's important to cover shoulders and knees, for men and women, because to show respect to the holy site. And then we'll look at oculesics, which is eye behavior and communication. And because relationships are so valued in Italy, eye contact is very important. And if you don't make contact with someone while you're speaking to them, it shows that you're untrustworthy, that you're hiding something, or perhaps that you just don't want to be in communication, which is seen as rude. Now, lastly, we look at olfactics, which is the perception of smell. And in Italy, this is mainly tied into food and also the history there. If you the smell of the ancient buildings and the artifacts there. So then we look down, if we see in all the differences between cultures how Italy is a bit different from the United States, and as with any communication from different kinds of people, there may be conflict. And so now we're going to look at the different conflicts that may arise between cultures and how to handle them. First, we're going to look at Young Kim's model of conflict, and this is just one model that helps to define what conflict between cultures looks like. So Young Kim's model says that there are three different levels that tie into why conflict happens. The first one is the micro level, which is an individual's belief and attitude that they bring into a conflict. So basically, just their own personal biases or opinions. The intermediary level is the location in the conflict. Context of the conflict, basically where it happens and why it happens, and then the macro level is the things that are out of the individual's control, basically like the history of their culture or um, anything that's happened in the past that they don't have personal control over. And so an example of this is, say there's a foreign exchange student studying in the United States from Jamaica, and as an individual on a micro level, he believes that each human is equal. However, the place he's studying in is dominantly rich and white, and so the people do not sound like him. They don't look like him, and he remembers how his father told him the history of his people and how the United States has many times been biased against different races. And because of this, there may be tension that arises or conflict that arises, especially if one of these people is rude to him or um, comes against him in any way. And so, even though his micro level beliefs and attitudes may be that all people are equal, the location and the context and the history of his culture may cause conflict. So that's just an example of how these different levels all tie into it. And it's not just a simple, straightforward reason for conflict. So there are different ways of resolving conflict. One of the ways that we saw in the textbook was Broom's model, and he based his model on the idea of dialogue, and he believed that if people would simply be in contact with each other and communicate, the conflict will be lessened. So his important aspect of this is dialogue, which is a Greek word. Dia means through or across, and log means words or reason. And so if we look at the next slide, we can see it. His model. He believes that sustained contact leads to reduced hostility, which leads to respect, which leads to peace, which leads to cooperation. So basically, you can see from the bottom up, dialogue makes these kind of different aspects possible, which leads to a culture of peace. So the first step is dialogue. And of course, it's very important that each person is willing to compromise and be open towards the other party involved. So, in the end, a person's entire background plays into the conflict and the way they handle it. It's important to keep that in mind. Dialogue is the first step. So, it's important when in conflict with someone to try to understand where they're coming from, and not only the micro levels, but also the different aspects, the macro levels and the intermediate levels. So, in this presentation, we've looked at stereotyping, ethnocentrism, we've looked at language, nonverbal communication, and also conflict, and how dialogue can help to solve that. So I hope that in this presentation you've learned more about Italy, and also that you're inspired to learn more about cultures for yourself and not just listen to what ethnocentrist stereotypes say about a culture, but to really get to know the individuals for yourself and to research the culture for yourself. Thank you.